Thanks everybody for coming this morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Paul Blackman. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Athletics Australia. So I look forward to having a chat and meeting you through this morning's symposium. Hopefully we've got something for everybody in takeaway messages this morning. And I know you've all had a busy week in the National Championships. It's been a long week, I'm sure, so far, so still another good day of competition left. First of all, I'd just like to introduce our speakers this morning. Jessica Rothwell is our lead dietitian who basically coordinates our nutrition services right across the state networks. Joan Oliver is our lead psychologist who does a similar role across the psychology services. And we've got our Melanie Perkis, our athlete wellbeing and engagement manager, who has an integral role in pulling a lot of this. She's the glue that pulls all of this together to help deliver these services. And then last but not least, our two wonderful athletes who've availed us of their time this morning. Our newly minted 1500 national champion, Lyndon Hall, from last night. And our pocket rocket race walker, Jemima Montag. Now, I point out that these two ladies have a kind of a unique take on this for you all this morning, as well as being obviously elite athletes. Lyndon's also a dietitian. And Jemima's just about to start her medical training in year one next year. So they've got essentially a foot in both camps, and I think have a unique perspective on this that will help put some context around this. So I think the reason we're here this morning really is to talk about what variably could be termed the concussion of our sport of athletics, and that's disordered eating and its related medical conditions. And I think there's a few points I'd like to briefly highlight before we get just to talk to our guidelines. The first is that this is something that happens at a very young age. And so for any parents or coaches who are here this morning, it's something that can be nipped in the bud at a very sort of formative stage in athletes' careers. By the time we get athletes at a high performance level at an open age, it's not that it's too late, but if we're dealing with something that's been present for a decade or more, it's very, very challenging. So if we can get recognition of that early incidents, we can start to put preventative measures and treatment measures in place that are far more effective. In terms of its prevalence, our sport in track and field is overrepresented if you look at all the NSOs in this area, and we recognise that acutely at Athletics Australia, and hence part of the reason why we're trying to put some strategies around that. The other thing is that it really doesn't discriminate. And there's perhaps a misconception out there in some circles that it's a female athlete problem. It also affects the guys, not necessarily equally, but in terms of incidence, but the effects that can be just as devastating, causing lifelong health consequences for some of these people. And for those coaches here this morning, I'd like to reassure you all that all of us here who work in the high performance space in Athletics Australia, we're not here to limit our athletes' performance. We're facilitating that. And I think we need to start that dialogue around the concept of energy balance and eating behaviours and recognise there's a spectrum, and that to achieve high performance, we need to challenge those boundaries and we need to push that to extremes, but we also need to learn to recognise when that becomes unhealthy and detrimental to people's wellbeing. It's tricky, it's difficult, but we all need to improve our skill set in that area. So really this morning we're all here to launch the disordered eating guidelines on behalf of Athletics Australia, and it would be totally remiss of me not to thank Jessica. She's done a power of work pulling this together over how long now?
We started, I think September, getting things together last year.
But there's a lot of background that was going before that, coordinating a lot of people. So Jess has done an amazing job pulling this together into a coherent, succinct document that's got implications for everyone, all the key stakeholders in this room. And I point out that this is a start, it's an evolving document, it's a live document, that everybody, all the stakeholders involved in this will continue to have input on in the years to come. The other thing is that it is what it says, it's guidelines, it's not a mandate for behaviour. So we're here to put a framework around this issue. It's a very difficult problem, it's a complex issue. But what we'd like to do is think that we can put together some resources and give people help when they need it, both in a geographical sense around Australia, in an intellectual sense with different website and different modules and modalities which we'll get to. And perhaps the most important thing is we want to think about the culture in this space. And in the high performance space, we really want to start to develop a positive culture in this area. And that starts with the behaviour of all of us from ground up and also from top down. So, the behaviours that we walk past and accept, I often think are the behaviours that we passively endorse. And we've got to really think about that, moving forward. So I'll perhaps pass on to Jess, without any more ado, who's going to flesh out these guidelines for you. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Paul. Just before we do so, we've just got a video from Eloise Wellings that we're going to share with you.
Hi everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't make it out there in person this morning, but I just wanted to say a huge thank you for taking the time to explore this really important issue of the management and prevention of disordered eating amongst our athletes. I had just won my first state title at 13 years of age when my eating disorder began. What started out as a really innocent idea to lose a kilo or two in order to try and run faster quickly spiraled out of control and into anorexia. I was careful to hide it from my parents and my coach and my training group, but it was glaringly obvious after just a few months of eating very little and training very hard. Nobody at the time knew what to do or what to say to help, so nobody said anything. All I heard was, "Wow, you look so light and fast and fit and amazing." And I often look back and think how it would have been different if someone had have said, "Hey, I see you, are you okay?" But that's why we're here, to change the narrative around this whole issue. And I did run faster for a short time. I ran the Sydney Olympic qualifying time for the 5,000 metres as a 16-year-old. But 2 weeks later, my body broke down and I suffered my first of 13 stress fractures, which will put me out of the next 3 Olympics. It wasn't until that first stress fracture that I admitted my struggle. My eating disorder was diagnosed and treated, except that much of the damage had already been done. A bone density scan revealing that I had the bone density of that of an 85-year-old woman. Thankfully, through surrounding myself with the right support, a psychologist and a nutritionist who were both skilled and experienced with dealing with disordered eating amongst athletes, I was able to form new ways of thinking and heal mentally and break the destructive habits that come along with having an eating disorder. It took 6 years before I was finally able to break the stronghold and fully heal and then get on with getting back to my goal of competing for Australia at the Olympics. I guess I was lucky. I was lucky, but I've seen this illness pause and even stop the promising future of many, many young athletes. So I just want to say thank you, coaches and support staff, for leaning into this. Thank you, athletes, for being vulnerable enough to share your experiences. And thank you, Athletics Australia, for creating language around a strategy forward. Thank you for being open to learn how to help. And thank you for being part of the change, how we can collectively support athletes who come up against this.
Okay, just before we move any further, can I see a show of hands of who has people in this space who's experienced it or knows of anyone? Yeah. So quite a lot. So obviously, we're all very aware that this is a challenge within our sport. We don't have exact prevalence and numbers yet, but as Paul mentioned, it certainly can occur across both male and female athletes. Some recent research, and a part of this, we really need to acknowledge the AIS and the National Eating Disorder Collaboration, who have put forward our recent position statement and consensus statement around how we best manage disordered eating in our athletes. And we certainly know that within athletes versus non-athletes, that disordered eating is more prevalent. Some of their recent prevalence data indicates between 0 and 19% in male athletes and up to 45% in female athletes. Obviously, we're aware as a high performance team of making sure that we've got structures and support in place for our NAS athletes. But we also know that this extends much more broadly to the community that is a part of Athletics Australia. And this was just a lovely text I received from one of my athletes that I think highlights pretty nicely that we need some form of awareness and a safe place for people to come and refer athletes. So obviously we're a small resource team, so we're not taking on additional work, but ensuring that we've got processes in place to help that safe referral. These were just a couple of other anecdotes, sharing a little bit more about, which we'll touch on in a moment, the value of fueling, as well as the risks of underfueling, and just highlighting again that this can occur in both male and female athletes. And I think it's probably not spoken about as much across our male athletes, and I think it's certainly an area that sits under the surface, which we're trying to really raise the awareness. So as Paul mentioned, this is just the very start in a small session, but what we hope to continue delivering further education. The AIS is going to be driving a lot of that, and with other professional organisations which will certainly look to lean into and help guide us as well. So just last night we've had all of our documents that have been created uploaded to the Athletics Australia website under High Performance and Medical. And essentially, our disordered eating guidelines, as Paul mentioned, they're not mandated, but they're a structure that helps with our high performance network increase the awareness, help support the identification and our management. And so we've developed, a triage referral network that we'll be sharing with all of our National Institute network, psychology leads, dietitians, the medical staff. So if we have an athlete within a relevant institute or academy that has been identified, that we've got the support services ready to go and set up. And we will be using the AIS mental health referral network within that as well. So when you have got time, I really do encourage you to read the AIS and NEDC position statement. That shares a lot about what this looks like, as well as the difference between disordered eating and an eating disorder. And as Paul mentioned, understanding that disordered eating can occur along a spectrum and at different points of an athlete or individual's career. I'm not sure if many of you are aware of what occurred across the pandemic in terms of the impacts of isolation. And the AIS has also got a site that provided some great fact sheets around support for athletes during that time. Because we certainly know through transition, relocation, injury, new relationships, so many different things, transition from junior to senior, that these can all be risk factors that could increase this illness and the disordered eating. So these are all accessible. We also have a community referral and triage network, and so Paul, Jonah and myself will be contactable via that. But essentially, if anybody has someone that they're worried about within the community or they're unsure, we can help guide that triage process to professional organisations that are very skilled and experienced within this space. We've got a couple of other fact sheets, a relative energy deficiency and sport fact sheet, which I'm just going to touch on in the next couple of slides, as well as a fact sheet from Sports Dietitians Australia around creating a positive performance culture. I think language is a big thing within our sport, as well as commentary around body, physique, composition, where there's been a lot of inappropriate language use, and a lot of it's used with humour quite often. But even the most resilient of athletes that might not be predisposed to the risk of disordered eating or an eating disorder can be significantly impacted by that. And we're starting to hear a lot of those stories from former athletes as well across many different sports. And just even yesterday, actually, speaking to one of our Paralympic athletes who I hadn't met before, we were doing a bit of a diet history, and I noted that there wasn't much carbohydrate, and I said, "Oh, do you often have pasta or rice-based meals?" And he said, no, I was told I was fat when I was needing to run middle distance. So my coach just cut my carbs, and sweet potato and wraps was all I should be having. And so this was 5 years ago that advice was provided. So We're really trying to change that and ensure that all of our athletes and broader community are really seeking professional guidance and advice, particularly if there's any areas around body composition that can be managed safely. And so part of our guidelines is also, next slide, is also some guidelines around body composition assessment and the safe processes that we would like to exist. So within our network and across our service providers, each institute will also be creating their own guidelines and policies around this area. But essentially, we really want to ensure that there is no harm that is occurred with any kind of body composition manipulation, and ensure that that's always brought back to a performance perspective. Which I think can be quite a grey area, and particularly for our adolescent athletes when their bodies are undergoing such change and growth and development, and they're expecting to be their senior counterparts as well. And it's really important that we support them, keep them nice and healthy, and make sure that they are transitioning really safely. Does anyone have any questions so far? I just wanted to bring up this slide. So this is a nice little infographic that sits within the AIS and NEDC position statement. And there is a relationship that exists between, is everyone familiar with the terms low energy availability and relative energy deficiency in sport?
Most? Only recently.
Only recently? Yeah, okay. So this area, it's certainly, I think, it's starting to become a little bit more mainstream, but we've got a fact sheet on REDS with some key takeaway messages, as well as signs and symptoms that you might be seeing within your athletes or noticing. And so that's a part of being aware and picking up on some of these things early. And what's, I guess, important to share is that low energy availability, or REDS, may occur in athletes that don't have disordered eating or eating disorders, and that can be related to their nutritional knowledge, what support they've actually had, or other factors. But we also know that there is a relationship that exists with disordered eating and eating disorders. So certainly something to be aware of. And I just wanted to pull this one up as well in terms of some additional kind of images and fact sheets on RED. So essentially, and Paul, if you'd like to speak to the medical side of this a little bit more, when an athlete's in a state of prolonged low energy availability, and we see this a lot in our adolescent athletes who are growing and developing, doing a hell of a lot of training, going to school, doing their extra sport, their bodies don't have enough energy to look after their normal healthy physiological functions. And so when that occurs chronically, that's where we start seeing changes to these physiological systems. And so that can impact, obviously, bone health. I think the big one that where people often think this is just a female-related issue is due to the menstrual cycle. And REDS has developed from the female athlete triad, so they understood that this also occurs in male athletes as well. But growth and development, injury, training quality also suddenly plateaus. So an athlete that is, having adequate rest and recovery is no longer able to perform at their best. And we also see a change to mental health as well, which Jonah might be able to touch on as well. So these areas, I guess, coexist a little bit, whether it's an inadvertent or not. I think it's something that just we all need to be more aware of, and ensuring that athlete is seeking the appropriate professional support. And that's where we've got the core multidisciplinary team. And we hope that we can develop those teams within the community as well, because there's lots of great practitioners out there. And it's, I guess, just being brave enough to be able to have that conversation with your athlete and be checking in. Okay. I think that's all from me, guys. Any questions? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on being vegan?
So, I guess vegan lifestyles and eating, it's a personal choice, and there are lots of other factors surrounding that decision. And sometimes a choice of dietary intake could be a reason to control something or to eliminate or to exclude different dietary areas. So it's if an athlete in particular is wanting to follow a vegan diet, it's really important we understand why, to ensure that there's no disordered eating or eating disorder background, but also, you know, to support them as best we can nutritionally, because we need to be quite creative and careful with different forms of supplementation and whole food as well. Yeah.
The only other thing I'd add to that is that from a medical perspective, for me it's a red flag that there's potentially other behaviour going on behind this, but we've got to be very careful not to prejudice our language and conversation, which hopefully the girls will talk about shortly, in terms of the way we come over with that. And we've got to have that in the background, but understand that there are plenty of vegan athletes out there who are very successful. So it's also an emerging area. You're seeing a lot more in that space in the public media and that sort of thing. And again, I think Lyndon and Jess are a better place to comment on that.
Yeah, I think it's about knowing who you're working with, that person, your athlete, and some of those other factors around, and if that's a means of controlling something or they're feeling like they need to change something, understanding why. So often we quite often see those dietary changes that are associated with a significant reason for wanting to change something, or they might have heard something through a friend. So I guess the area, as Lyndon will know, our area of nutrition and dietetics, there's a lot of misinformation out there, which can be really challenging when there's lots of noise, and hearing some of these messages from people that don't have a nutritional science background. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I might pass on to Jonah now, who can put some context around the situation before we get our athlete panel up for a good Q&A session.
Perfect, thanks, Paul. I think I just want to double down on what they've both said, that elite sport requires extreme measures. And we're in the HP arm of Athletics Australia, so it would be really easy for us to sit here and go, just exercise less and eat more, problem solved. That's not what we're about. You know, we play in the space of pushing the boundaries of performance, which requires dietetic manipulation, psychological sort of, moving into psychological extremes and finding that cutting edge. So this is not about dialing down performance one bit. It's actually about highlighting that if you get it wrong, there's a massive consequence on performance and lasting mental health and physical health. So it's not one at the extreme or the other. It's actually about getting it right. And to start with that, I think we need to talk about the barriers. And almost from an empathetic standpoint, it's bloody hard. Like, if you're a coach here in the audience, how hard is it to go, do I have that conversation with that athlete or not? Do I know anything about that? I'm not a doctor, a psychologist, a dietitian. They're running a bit quicker maybe. So I just want to start by acknowledging that even as medical professionals, it's really hard to even enter that conversation at times. Even as athletes, sometimes it's hard to even recognise internally what's going on. So there's a lot of barriers. And unlike a hamstring tear, it's really easy to identify and get treated. This is one that's sometimes a bit more insidious. It sort of creeps in a little bit, and then often it's not until it's really affecting that athlete that help is sort of put around that person. So I sort of wouldn't mind just turning to you guys and opening up and maybe sharing with the audience, when you look back at your time in the sport, if it's still current, what those barriers were or are, even for yourselves or for friends or colleagues you've got. What makes it hard for the early identification or reaching out, do you think?
I think the biggest one that jumps out at me when I hear that is just talking about periods from a girl's perspective. I mean, obviously there's more and more female coaches that are probably more comfortable having those conversations, but I guess I was pretty happy to talk about it with a coach when I was pretty young, and it very much through my junior coach, and he told me to have a week off, and I was like, I'm just a bit tired. I'm just trying to tell you what's going on, give you some context as to why it was a great session. And I've probably continued to keep pushing that, and I've even had a female coach who was a bit like, no, I don't know about it. And yeah, I think just coaches and athletes being confident enough to have that conversation and understanding how it fits into all of this and how important it is, because it can be a really useful tool for girls, because boys don't have that luxury. It might give us the chance to pick up on something sooner, and it's something that doesn't involve getting a blood test or a further investigation, it's pretty easy to say, oh gosh, I've missed 2 periods. That's a bit of a warning sign. I'll go chat to Paul or Jess about that and, take it from there. So I think, just knowing that, athletes are largely pretty happy to talk about it, or younger athletes might not know where this all fits. So, making sure they are aware, or their parents are aware if they are younger, just sort of getting a conversation started. And I think if you're talking about it when you're younger, you're not going to get a bit queasy about it later in life, probably. And, I think I know a lot of the girls, I'm sure Jen does as well. It's really useful to be able to track and keep an eye on things, because it's sort of when things might start to not go as well, it's sort of one of those things you can look back on, as well as how much training was I doing and things like that. And even everything I've studied at uni and stuff, I kind of got caught out about 2 years ago and kind of dug myself into a little bit of a cross-training hole. That was one thing that I think it was Jess I was having a conversation with, and I was like, oh, actually I did miss my last period, and I have been doing a lot of cross-training, and I don't normally ride a bike every day. I normally run, and a few sort of things like that. So
how about for yourself? Anything that you reflect upon that makes it hard for yourself or others to reach out? Or
Yeah, I think a couple of things. The main, in terms of my story, with race walking, as a junior, you're doing 3, 5, 10 kilometres, because the senior distance is 20, and that's a bit much for young people. So I finished school at 18, and the jump from 10k to 20k was quite significant in terms of the overall training load. I had a change in coach as well, and I think in my brain, I sort of made the Commonwealth Games team at that point, which I didn't expect to do, and I was all of a sudden a senior athlete. My distance had doubled, my training load had probably quadrupled, because during year 12 I sort of did nothing. And I think my thought, not knowing any of this stuff yet and not having connected properly with a sports dietitian yet, was, elite athletes that I've seen in images from the Olympics, they look so lean and tiny. And okay, if I want to be like that, or if I'm going to the Commonwealth Games now, I better restrict my food, because I for me it was quite a linear, I'm going to do all of this training. I didn't even think I should probably fuel it. I just thought, well, I need to look like that. And it was all about form rather than function. So training probably tripled, fueling probably halved. And what made it tricky in the beginning was that there was no recognizable problem, because as we've touched on already, in that acute phase, as you're restricting and training more and getting lighter and lighter, there is a small window, like what Eloise Welling said, where it does feel easier and you do go faster for a really short amount of time. And then everything goes downhill, because you eventually fall into that cycle of injury and re-injury and not recovering and plateauing at best, or going down in terms of performance. So initially, the barrier, it's a bit strange to frame it as a barrier, but the barrier to not recognizing and talking to anyone about it was that it was invisible and sort of obscured by the fact that everything seemed to be going so well. And I guess underlying all of that, the second barrier was that I was thinking with such tunnel vision that the food I put into my body was only informing my physique. I didn't think about any of those other things in the diagrams on the screen, in terms of how it was that food is information for all of the other biological processes that have to be going on for us. I mean, I was such a busy, I was leading this crazy life where, as Jess was saying, with athletes at those key transition points, you may see them for training, or if you're a parent at home, but they're doing 20 other things in the day, potentially, if there's uni and part-time jobs and socializing and all of these things, not just training, need fuel. So it was a real learning curve that was sort of 3 years ago. And they were the early barriers for me.
Really interesting from both of you. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the function of restrictive eating or increasing training load, in that psychologically what we see is it often comes from a place of performance initially, but then we know that there's a huge psychological component about, the social reinforcers of looking leaner,
Yeah.
And that's where sometimes it tips into serving another function. Do you have any comments around that slippery slope of, whilst well-intentioned maybe initially, it actually then becomes more of a secondary?
I guess the moment for me was when I was at college in the US. I stood in a tree root and broke my foot. It sucked. So missed all of cross-country season. And then I came down to training the first day of the next semester, and I don't think I was running yet. I think I just started jogging. I came down to see everyone after break, and I walked in and the coach just said to me, "Well, you don't look like a runner anymore, do you?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." And then I was like, "Oh, okay, well, better get onto that." And this was, I was a dietetic student at the time, so I probably should have known better, and it's probably why I was able to catch myself. But did probably spend 2 months, I remember rationing carrot sticks while I was studying, and I was like counting down, I was like, okay, 15 minutes, you can have another one. And it was like, these are allocated snacks for the day, and it was just so rigid and exhausting. And it was when I was reintroducing running, which was a terrible idea. Because, I was sort of surprised I didn't get a second injury at that point. But I think, kind of just having probably a bit more knowledge than most of the athletes, because of what I was studying at the time, probably allowed me to kind of catch it and be like, no, this doesn't add up, this is stupid. But that one comment from that coach was so powerful. Obviously being the college system, there was a scholarship that was dependent on, how you were running and all of that as well. I missed the cross-country season, so I started thinking about all the flow-on effects. But I think if you weren't in a space where you were getting information from somewhere else, that could have, I probably would have had more broken bones than the one from the tree root.
I think it's a really important thing you're getting on, where often athletes are motivated by, all we want to do is perform, really. So I think initially when some of these disordered eating patterns start, it is because we honestly, we think we're doing the right thing to get to that finish line and reach that goal. And I can speak from experience with that. But in the process of doing so, even if performance was the initial, I'm doing this because I think it'll lead me to X, Y, or Z, if then body composition changes and we're receiving feedback that that's a great thing, or positive or negative feedback, then the story can change and it can become about how we look rather than the performance. And I think this is a really, really key space for everyone in this room today, coaches and parents, about language. And I think language is really going to be how we move forward with this, because telling an athlete that, just commenting about an athlete's body in any way, whether it be positive or negative, it stays with us forever. I can remember comments from years and years and years ago, and they stay in the back of your mind, and you sort of remember them when you're going to make decisions around food throughout the day or around training. I think we need to get rid of a lot of phrases like telling someone they look fit, because fitness is a physiological measure. If you see someone's VO2 max result, if you see a training session and the times they've done, then you can tell them they seem that they are fit according to their medical results. But the idea that you can look fit then plants the idea in our mind that leanness and fitness and performance are all on par, and that can be really confusing, because I know plenty of examples of people who look fit according to coaches and others, and they're really underperforming because they're not fueling, or they're not in the best headspace, or there's so many other factors at play. And on the flip side of that, you may look at an athlete and say, oh, maybe they don't look fit or whatever, when in fact they're really happy, they're healthy, they're functioning well, they're training really well, and they're actually performing much better than the one who was, say, the leanest.
Really well said. And I think one thing I'd say is we know that athletes are slightly more prone to obsessionality and perfectionism. Slightly? But
I'm fully aware.
So
Can I just...
you go.
Oh, sorry, just add a point into what Jem was saying. So that there's a focus on leanness and thinness, but we also can't forget that disordered eating disorder also occurs in larger bodies and at a stable weight. And there is cases where we referred somebody for weight loss or for body composition change, and yet they've got an undiagnosed binge eating disorder or something like that. So I think we've got to be really careful about, as Jem said, the language, but also understanding that regardless of somebody's physique, we can't use that as a point of judgment or an assumption of where they're at without having a conversation.
Yeah, and so it's a very valid point. And I think when we're working with athletes, we need to go in eyes wide open that we've got increased vulnerabilities in that the feedback, the language, the information we give them when they do have a obsessional, perfectionistic mindset is a bit like putting a little bit of petrol on the fire at times. So we have to really think carefully around that. Back to you guys around how to get it right. If you think back, wind the clock back even, what are some ideas for the broader athletics community to think about what can we do differently? How can we get it right? You had your time again. Any I mean, you're not here to solve this problem, but anything you can reflect upon that would help?
I think the language one is huge on that front as well. We covered that in a way, and I think even just better awareness from which this is a great starting point from coaches, athletes, parents, and being more open about relevant conversations so that these things are picked up earlier rather than later, and they don't become full blown, and people know where they can go for help and who is the right person to help because and just where they're getting their advice. I think sort of looking back on sort of some of the junior programs I was involved in, which wasn't a lot. I didn't go to any World Juniors or anything, but sort of the under 17 camps and Falls Creek camps and things like that. And I think it was really fun. You'd go to the AIS and it was like, okay, we're going to do body composition measurements, just a one-off, no context, and then you get given some numbers and you compare it with your friends. And there was no purpose to that. It was probably not very appropriate for that age group. And we were just sent off, and the coach might make comments about it, or you sort of like, oh, that girl beat me at nationals, and hers was this number lower, but there was no education around what it was. It was just like, oh, this is what senior athletes do, and it felt fun and flashy and things like that. And then even I think some of the senior athletes I was exposed to, which some taught me some incredible things, but there's this one session where an athlete spoke to a group of distance athletes. It was probably about 15, 16 at the time, and they basically said something along the lines of, I had a stress fracture at the end of every season. That's what I had to do to be my best. And I would kind of think back to the people who were in that room at the time, and some of them are very impressionable people, and I sort of wonder, did that have a real impact on you? Because a couple of them have really struggled with injury and things like that, and you're sort of like, I remember cluing in and being like, that sounds wrong. But when someone who's been to the Olympics and done everything that you're dreaming to do as a 15-year-old is up there saying, this is what I did, like I said, I
think it's very powerful to think a bit about the culture, the mentors, the language you put around developing athletes. It's really, really, really powerful about you.
I think in terms of where to from here, the thing that really shifted things for me was when we attacked everything with a performance mindset, like where performance is the goal, rather than framing things in terms of sort of physique or anything like that, because we know and we have to accept that in endurance, I mean, I don't really know about the other events, but in the endurance space, and probably most of us are from that space anyway, body composition is a factor, like it is important, and we can't completely sort of forego that idea. But I think really starting as coaches and parents to start to understand the importance of periodizing body composition throughout the year. There's a great guy over in Canada, Trent Stellingworth, and he, what would his title be? A sports physician?
I think he's a
Sports
scientist, exercise scientist professor.
He's put out some excellent studies, which we could even add to this bank for you guys, because his wife is an Olympic endurance runner for Canada. Lyndon's raced her in Rio, there you go. And they did an awesome study tracking her the periodization, so like the up and downs of her body composition throughout her 12 years of her career, and there was pregnancies involved in there, and there was off seasons and Olympic races and ups and downs, and it was really interesting because they plotted it on this graph, and they plotted it against her performance, and amazingly, there was the fluctuations in body composition, but there was a beautiful linear upwards trend in her performance. It was just, she continued to improve, and every season there was time to be in, let's just say, a race, performance, body composition. There were times then after that race where she allowed herself to come to a happy, healthy training body composition. There were times with pregnancy and up and down, but it was always up in terms of performance. And I think that was really when the penny dropped for me, realising that thought I mentioned before as a young transitioning to a senior athlete, where I thought, oh, all the photos I've seen on social media or on Google, on whatever, of Olympic athletes, they look, like this on that one day. And I completely assumed that's how you must look 365 days of the year. But aiming for that is impossible and really not a good idea for our mental or physical health long term. So understanding, and what Trent says is that if we only expect ourselves to be in, say, peaking in terms of the performances we can produce, say, on one or two occasions, like we want to be peaking last night for the Olympic trial, and then
That too.
at the Olympic Games, then we can only sort of expect that we'll be in that sort of peak performance, body composition a couple of times as well. And the rest of the year, knowing that we can encourage our athletes to find their happy, healthy body composition, and not talk about it as heavier or softer around the edges, like I've heard a coach say. They're just different. We don't need to attach emotion or merit to one or the other and say that the race body composition that's so lean is really the one that we're all wanting and it looks great, and complimenting your athlete around that time. Don't say good or bad things at either time. It's just it's one thing that we do, and then it's another thing that we do that one supports performance and the other sort of is really important for health and happiness, and neither is good or bad. I think that's the way forward.
Yeah, really well said. I'd like to throw it to the floor now. If there's any burning questions, you want to pick anyone here on the panel's expertise around or lived experience.
We do have a few questions which have been sent in from coaches who can attend.
Oh, lovely.
Cool.
Nice.
Well, hello.
This might be a good one for you tomorrow, actually, speaking of language. Is it ever right for a coach to ask athletes to monitor their calories in, specifically with young athletes?
No, I don't think so.
I would say no.
No.
Yeah, I would suggest no, and there probably needs to be a greater conversation and referral to an accredited sports dietitian to help understand or help provide that knowledge and education with respect to their lifestyle and what they're doing from a training perspective as well. Yeah, I think, for some people that are relearning how to eat and how to nourish their bodies, sometimes different calorie counters can be helpful to ensure that they're actually getting enough in. But for others, it can be a very slippery slope and there can be obsession. So depending on the personality that we're dealing with, it can be more risky than not. So I think we're better looking at whole food, nourishing our bodies, using our sports nutrition knowledge. And as Jem mentioned, there were times across an athletic career where the body's in a happy, healthy training state, and intuitive eating, those sports nutrition principles are really important, versus times where there might be specific strategies used for purposeful performance.
So I'll play the devil's advocate here. Say a coach sees an athlete in a state where they think you're not going to achieve high performance in the state you're in. How would you like a coach to approach that? What avenues, what methods would you think might be appropriate?
Well,
And I don't want to put you on the spot. You may have encountered this, but I'm sure this is something that, I suspect it's something that every coach will go through in their career.
and
And this is part of the difficult dynamic that exists. It's a complex issue.
is this a possibly incorrect assumption purely off someone's appearance that we're making here.
It might be a number of variables, as you girls have highlighted.
Because I think obviously it's worth having a conversation about everything that's going on
Yeah.
in their life. You know, maybe there's something that you're really missing because, you know, as a coach, you might only see them a couple hours a week. You're not seeing their whole life. So if their performance is not going well, you know, I don't think jumping onto, oh, you need to lose weight or something is the first port of call, definitely. I think it's, you know, probably having a chat about, is everything okay? Is school okay? Is uni okay? Are you stressed? You know, there might be a number of things going on in their life. They might, you know, not be sleeping enough because they've got 1,000 uni assignments and they're working a part-time job and everything like that. And, you know, there might be something more complex going on medically as well. But, you know, so I think, yeah, it's probably worth breaking it down. And then if, you know, it does warrant maybe bringing in someone outside and referring on to, you know, one of you three lovely people or something like that. Rather than making assumptions.
My observations in that space, Paul, is that it's quite an easy go-to just say cut weight. It's almost like and it's the excuse of why the performance isn't occurring maybe in a coach's mind, so therefore they can go to that versus actually looking at the complexity and the whole human and all the factors. So
Lazy coaching.
But I think there's an assumption too, if the athlete is not appearing in their physically best state, that they might be eating too much, or rather than perhaps they're underfueling and not eating enough, and therefore they've dropped their lean muscle mass and their body composition has changed during that process. So I think it's just to help try to, because it is obviously a very sensitive issue, to refer to a team of professionals and to make sure that they're doing everything they can to optimise their performance rather than something's wrong with you. So bringing it back to the performance conversation, which then there can be a formal clinical assessment screening for other issues or areas that need to be optimised for that athlete.
I think you're dead right with language, because it's not just about the food, is it? It's like they have to work hard, they have to do tough sessions. They have, how many times do you see an Instagram post on the grind, you know, that killed, and I guess sub-elite and junior athletes look up to guys like you, and some of the elite guys post stuff about their sessions and how big they were, and Strava I don't think helps anyone. I don't think Instagram really helps anyone. So you're dead right with the language, and we all need to work on that.
And I think
we need help.
Athletes need to be aware of the language that they're using as well. And I've seen those examples too, Gav, in social media posts where we've got quite high performing athletes that are very, you know, meeting quite an impressionable younger population who might be aspiring to be those athletes, and without support around them, they could be set up for failure.
Another question down there.
I'm just commenting as a parent, and I guess I do work in the health field. I think with regard to, from what I can see with coaches, one of the important things is not necessarily directing or making decisions, but over time empowering athletes to be able to monitor themselves. So one of the things I've done quite a bit with young people is encouraging them almost to make a bit of a Venn diagram of mind, body and environment, and where they intersect is performance. And then that teaches them to, I guess, reflect if they go through what's happening in my body at the moment, what's working well, what's not, environmentally, what's working well and what's not. And then over time, they become the experts in themselves, they learn those skills. So in terms of when a coach would need to sort of initiate some change because of something going on physically, it's more encouraging the young person to have a look themselves and almost coaching them with that, as opposed to the coach deciding something needs to happen.
I think that's a very, very valuable comment, and to me it highlights there's not one route to solve this. It's multifactorial, and it will differ in different athletes, in different coach-athlete pairs, and we'll have multiple different solutions that we see across our whole NAS high-performance cohort. And so it's highly personality dependent, as you were talking about. It's highly coach dependent. And
Sorry.
Have we got any more questions?
I do have one that's semi-related to that one. When does that education start with an athlete?
So,
When does education start? When should education around this start as an athlete? What age do you think you would have been benefited from starting to have this conversation?
Well, I think you're exposed to a lot just from being involved in the sport. So I think if there's a shift in culture, that education is going to start without a formal education, because you're going to go down and join a training group or athletics club, and people aren't going to be making inappropriate comments, and people are going to say, has everyone got snacks for after training and things like that. And if that's a training group you're showing up to, you're going to really start to develop good habits really early on. So I think almost that informal education is really important, because obviously a lot of this is quite complex. It wouldn't be appropriate to have a conversation with someone who's 12, probably, would just overwhelm them probably.
Can I just unpack that?
Yeah.
What she just said there was actually brilliant in that we often offload this on the athlete. When should you be educated? What age should the athlete be educated? The system should be educated, and then it doesn't really matter what age that athlete comes into the system, it's been educated. And I think we've got to take that responsibility as the system around these athletes and not placate that onto them. It's not their job to be better educated. We have a responsibility as a system to do a better job so that they can come into that environment.
Isn't that your greatest challenge though, that the system is so large and complex?
100%.
And you've got, I think this is congratulations by the way, I think it's fabulous and it's wonderful listening to you two speaking about this. But so where do you start? It's Eden analysis.
I'd just like to make one, sorry to chime in, but we've been working in the high performance space in athletics for some time at both the recognition and promotion of the coach as the key facilitator of all of these behaviours. And because of the way athletics is delivered and run in this country, it has to be that way. We're different to other sports. Other sports have quite different structures in the way they will deliver programs like this, deliver cultural change, deliver educational programs. But everybody as a coach is just pivotal. And they are the coach-athlete pair is the centre of the universe. So in terms of implementing a program, it must be essentially in the system with coaches, I think, as a primary, if not the key stakeholder, one of the key stakeholders. And there's education, there's cultural change, there's language, all these things we've been talking about. And it's a challenge.
I was going to say...
The education program process is a continuum. As a coach, that's got to start right from the beginning at a level that the athlete can understand. It's taking them on a journey, and the whole thing is one about empowerment as you talk, but it's a progressive process.
But if we look at the interactions that athletes have with different people as they progress through their careers, the most powerful influence is going to be their parents in their formative years.
Absolutely.
And often a coach if they're interacting at that early stage. So whilst it's all well and good for us as health professionals to get up here and espouse the science and blah, 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 what really matters is what are those informal conversations that, not the formal education, but those little things, the listening and the observation of, athletes have role models, both in coaches and other athletes. So it's the non-verbal things that make a huge difference.
Elaborating on that point, I think sometimes when we think about education, we're imagining some sort of textbook or pamphlet that's going to be handed to all the kids and it'll be really official. But exactly what Paul's saying, it's the tiny little everyday informal conversations and things that we do, which is where our education or all those little ideas are planted. And at the moment, with this rise of social media, and the junior athletes from the age of 10 are looking on these screens every single day, and it makes, I know Jess and I have had conversations about how difficult that makes the job of a sports dietitian, because you can be anyone, maybe with a nutrition degree or not, and go online and influence these young athletes and tell them, this is what you should be doing, this is what I do, you're going to look like this if you follow this, and it's rubbish information compared to what the accredited sports dietitians know. That coupled with the role modelling by more senior established athletes, which may or may not be appropriate, the younger athletes, that's their education. That these little screens is really how they're learning, and then the role modelling done by coaches and family members on a daily basis. So they're the spaces we need to be changing, as opposed to waiting for some official sort of textbook to be handed to them in their education.
So,
And I guess moving forward and what's already started happening, I guess, and it's a bit more formal education, we've got our pre-NAS target talent program, and there's been the start of further education in around nutrition, psychology, and mental health training that targets coaches, athletes, as well as parents. And obviously Jill and Blair look after the coaching space, so we've started bringing education in terms of the energy deficiency into those programs too. So we've got multiple touch points that we can be feeding in education that hopefully helps start creating culture change. And if we're leading it from an NSO, one of the largest sporting organisations, hopefully we're starting to create a trickle-down effect into the community to help create that change, help create those, recovery training snacks. And I think a coach or a parent can play a really easy pivotal role in, here are some up and goes or some yogurts to have after your training session in an esky. Just a side note, we've submitted a grant as well to hopefully have some more funding and resources to help disseminate a lot of the work that the AIS is doing and what we see is so valuable to continue. So that can be a challenge as well.
And Jess, it's such a good point that we need our coaches exposed to these things early, so that because the language that's used can start very early in an athlete's journey, and I think it's really important that it's fantastic, there's high performance, and it trickles down so that we can expose the early coaches to the appropriate language that they can use, so that nobody says to Lyndon she doesn't look like a road.
so
I was going to say it'd be good to highlight those people who are doing it well and who you can trust. Just to promote the good stuff that is happening, so that people sort of can follow those pathways. We found a lovely dietitian and he was great, but then he was diagnosed, giving my son a program that included hemp seeds and whatever. And it's like, sorry, like he was lovely, but you missed the athlete part of it.
So it's a good point. We've got on the AA High Performance, we've got a health practitioner network which will continue to grow and evolve, particularly with the disordered eating space. So they're state-based sports dietitians, sports psychologists, sports doctors that I guess are our trusted people. And that's just not an exhaustive list, but just reach out if you need advice, guidance.
And the AIS has just launched what they call a Female Health Performance Initiative, FHPI. If you look on the ais.gov.au website, you'll see there's a whole section, and it's
Kimberly
really
Wells.
What's that?
Is that Kimberly Wells?
And Rachel Harris.
Yeah.
It's really a wonderful selection of resources for all of the stakeholders involved in this area, from athletes to parents to coaches to practitioners. There's educational modules as well as fact sheets and little snippets that coaches can use for athletes, that parents can use for how do I manage this sort of stuff? How do I get into this space? I don't get this. I don't have those skills. So
we've got links in some of the fact sheets to those resources as well that will be accessible.
I think to your question, it's the narrative will fundamentally shift when people see it as a risk to performance, not at a cost of performance. And unless we can show the science and the results behind it, it probably won't shift. But when you actually, the opening video showing I failed, I didn't actually fulfill my Olympic potential until I got it right, until our coaches fundamentally see that cutting a bit of weight or being a bit leaner isn't actually a solution to performance. You actually have to get the whole thing right, and then you truly get performance. I think that's when we'll see a shift in the system.
And I think to your point, highlighting people that are doing the right thing, I think we do need to develop that positive culture.
Yeah.
It's no value in us just saying, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. We've got to find the people from grassroots right up to high level who can really drive this as sort of leaders within this space.
And I think that's kind of an advantage athletics has in how we work. In every second squad might have one athlete that's within the system that is getting exposed to things, and they can go back to their squad that might have kids as young as 12, and they can role model these good behaviours for them. And that athletes, they're in the VIS and they bring snacks after training, and they've got a banana before their training session. They're or is fueling well and things like that, and they'll start to have that trickle down behaviour, and it's probably highlighting those behaviours in some of those maybe more experienced or educated athletes that are doing it right within your squads on the ground, and being like, oh, you know, you should bring, you know, a muesli bar after training as well, like Sally, or, you know, things like that. So I think that's a really easy way that, you know, you can share information.
Yeah.